Hello there, weary wanderers of the modern world. I'm Thomas, and tonight I'll be your guide through the dimly lit corridors of history, where the shadows hold secrets that textbooks prefer to whisper about rather than proclaim. Before we begin our journey, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something wonderfully intimate about knowing we're sharing this moment across continents and time zones, united by nothing more than curiosity and the peculiar comfort of learning about the past, while the present world sleeps around us. Tonight, we're not discussing kings or conquests, plagues or politics. No, tonight we're exploring something far more personal, far more human, and infinitely more complicated. We're talking about love, or rather we're talking about what happened when love dared to exist outside the narrow boundaries that civilizations tried to draw around it. You see, the story of same-sex love in ancient times isn't the neat, sanitized narrative you might expect. It's messier, stranger, more contradictory than our modern minds often want to accept. It's a story of gods who loved without regard for gender, of emperors who married their male lovers in public ceremonies, of societies that celebrated certain forms of same-sex relationships while condemning others with breathtaking cruelty. Tonight, we'll walk through the marble halls of ancient Rome, where a senator might keep a beloved male companion, while his wife tends to matters of politics and property. We'll drift down the Nile to ancient Egypt, where the afterlife promised eternal union, regardless of the earthly forms love had taken. These aren't fairy tales or modern projections onto the past. These are the complicated, contradictory, beautifully human stories that ancient peoples actually lived. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to discover that the past, as always, was far stranger and more wonderful than we've been led to believe. Let's begin with part 1, the Marble Empire, where love, like everything else, was a matter of power, politics, and exquisite, dangerous beauty. We begin in Rome, not because it was the first civilization to grapple with same-sex love, but because it was perhaps the most magnificently contradictory about it. This was an empire that built its identity on conquest, discipline, and rigid social hierarchies, yet somehow produced some of history's most famous same-sex love affairs. It was a society that worshipped gods who changed gender on whims, yet could condemn a man to social death for being too passive in bed. Picture, if you will, the Rome of Augustus Caesar. The year is 15 BCE. The marble gleams white in the Mediterranean sun, the aqueducts flow with engineering precision, and somewhere in a villa, overlooking the Tiber, a wealthy senator named Marcus is having his morning toilet performed by a beautiful Greek slave named Alexios. This is not a scene of exploitation, though exploitation certainly existed. This is something more complex, more tender, and infinitely more dangerous. You see, Marcus doesn't just own Alexios, he loves him. And in the twisted logic of Roman law and custom, this love is simultaneously acceptable, celebrated, and utterly forbidden, depending on who's asking and what mood the emperor happens to be in that particular decade. Let's start with what Romans actually believed about desire itself. If aught but Romans actually believed about desire itself. Unlike our modern world, which tends to categorize people as gay, straight, or something in between, Romans thought about sex the way they thought about most things, in terms of power. The question wasn't whether you desired men or women. The question was whether you were doing the penetrating, or being penetrated. Were you the dominant partner, or the submissive one? Were you acting like a proper Roman citizen, or were you, gods forbid, acting like a woman? This distinction was everything. A Roman citizen could have sex with as many men as he pleased, provided he was always the active partner. He could love them, write poetry about them, even adopt them into his household. But the moment he was suspected of being the passive partner, of enjoying being penetrated, his social standing crumbled faster than poorly mixed concrete. He became what Romans called a synidus, a word that roughly translates to pathetic bottom, but carried the social weight of complete civic death. The irony, of course, is that someone had to be the passive partner, and Rome, being Rome, had a neat solution for this problem. Slaves, foreigners, and younger men who hadn't yet achieved full citizenship. These people existed in a strange sexual limbo, where they could be desired, loved, even celebrated, but never fully respected. They were beautiful objects in a world that worshipped beauty, but they were still objects. Take the story of Emperor Hadrian, and his beloved Antinius. Here was the most powerful man in the known world, a military genius, who built walls across Britain and rebuilt the Pantheon, completely besotted with a young man from Bithynia. When Antinius died mysteriously in the Nile at the age of 20, Hadrian didn't just mourn him, he declared him a god. He founded cities in his honor. He commissioned more statues of Antinius than exist of most emperors. And here's the thing, no one thought this was strange. Oh, they gossiped about it. Certainly. Court gossip was the lifeblood of Roman aristocracy. But the idea that the emperor might love a young man wasn't scandalous. What was scandalous was how openly he grieved, how completely he allowed his private pain to become public spectacle. Romans expected their leaders to have favorites. They just expected them to maintain the fiction that it was all about power and patronage, not genuine emotion. But let's step away from emperors for a moment and talk about ordinary Romans. Or rather, let's talk about what passed for ordinary in a society where your average citizen owned at least one slave and considered olive oil both a food and a personal lubricant. Roman marriages, you must understand, were not about love. They were about property, political alliances, and the production of legitimate heirs. A wealthy Roman man might be genuinely fond of his wife, might even respect her intelligence and business acumen, but he was never expected to be faithful to her. Infidelity wasn't just tolerated, it was assumed. The only question was with whom you chose to be unfaithful, and this is where things get interesting. Because while a Roman husband could sleep with slave girls, prostitutes, or other men's wives, without much social consequence, his most meaningful emotional relationships often developed with men. These weren't necessarily sexual relationships, though they often were. They were relationships of intellectual equality, of shared interests, of genuine companionship, in a way that was rarely possible between husbands and wives. Consider the letters between Cicero and his young protege Marcus Caelius Rufus. Their correspondence is filled with affection, worry, advice, and a tenderness that Cicero rarely shows in his letters to his wife. When Caelius is away on military campaign, Cicero writes to him like a lover, counting the days until his return, worrying about his health, sending him gifts and money. Whether their relationship was sexual is ultimately unknowable, and in Roman terms, largely irrelevant. What mattered was the emotional intimacy, the mutual devotion, the way they prioritized each other's welfare above almost everything else. This pattern repeated throughout Roman society. Men formed intense bonds with other men, bonds that often lasted decades and shaped the course of their lives in ways their marriages never did. They called these relationships amicitia, friendship, but friendship doesn't really capture the depth and complexity of what they meant to each other. The Roman poet Catullus wrote some of the most passionate love poetry in Latin literature. Much of it was addressed to a woman he called Lesbia, but some of his most tender verses were written to and about young men. His poem to Juventius, a beautiful boy he's clearly infatuated with, is achingly vulnerable. I would like to be able to say that I love you modestly, Juventius, or to love you with dignity, but I cannot. For even if I could become more chaste than you are now beautiful, still I could not help but love you as you are. This wasn't considered strange or inappropriate, it was considered beautiful. Roman literary culture celebrated same-sex desire as one of the highest forms of aesthetic and emotional experience. The greatest Roman poets wrote about it. The greatest Roman philosophers discussed it. It was woven into the fabric of educated Roman life. But here's where the contradictions multiply, like rabbits in spring. While Romans celebrated certain forms of same-sex love, they were also capable of breathtaking cruelty toward those who violated their very specific rules about how such love should be expressed. The Emperor Caligula, never one for subtlety, once forced a Roman senator to dress as a woman and perform oral sex on him in front of the entire Senate. This wasn't about desire, this was about humiliation, about reducing a citizen to the status of a slave or prostitute. The senator in question, one Valerius Catullus, was reportedly so ashamed that he went home and killed himself. Or consider the fate of actors and gladiators, men whose professions automatically marked them as sexually available to their social superiors. They lived in a strange twilight world, where they could be beloved by crowds, showered with gifts from admirers, even taken as lovers by emperors. but they could never escape the fundamental fact that their bodies were not their own. They were entertainment, and entertainment, in Rome, was always tinged with cruelty. The gladiator, who caught the eye of a wealthy patron, might find himself living in luxury, educated in literature and philosophy, treated almost like a son. But he was still property. His beauty, his youth, his very life, belonged to someone else. When he aged or was injured, or simply fell out of favor, he could be discarded as easily as a broken amphora. This brings us to one of the most complex figures in Roman sexual history, the Emperor Elagabalus. Born in Syria as Varius Avitus Bassianus, he became emperor at the age of 14, through the machinations of his grandmother Julia Maesa. What happened next reads like a fever dream of gender transgression and religious ecstasy. Elagabalus didn't just have male lovers, he married them, publicly, with full ceremony. He took the name of his Syrian sun god and insisted on being called by feminine titles. Ancient historians claim he offered vast sums to any physician who could give him female anatomy. He wore makeup, jewelry, and women's clothing to official state functions. Now, we must be careful here. Ancient historians had their own biases, their own reasons for exaggerating or inventing scandalous details about unpopular emperors. But even accounting for historical embellishment, it's clear that Elagabalus challenged Roman gender norms in ways that made even the notoriously decadent imperial court uncomfortable. The Romans could accept an emperor who loved men, who kept male concubines, who wrote poetry to beautiful boys. What they couldn't accept was an emperor who seemed to want to become a woman himself. This violated the fundamental Roman principle that citizens, especially male citizens, should be strong, dominant, and unambiguously masculine. Elagabalus ruled for less than 4 years. He was assassinated at the age of 18, along with his mother, by his own guards. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber. His name was struck from official records. The Roman Senate passed a damnatio memoria, a formal condemnation of his memory that was supposed to erase him from history entirely. But here's what's fascinating. They failed. Elagabalus was remembered precisely because he had pushed against the boundaries of what Roman society could tolerate. He had shown them the limits of their own sexual flexibility, and those limits were clearer than they might have preferred to admit. Because for all their celebration of male beauty and same-sex desire, Romans were deeply invested in maintaining clear gender roles. Men could love men, but they had to do so as men. They could be tender, passionate, even devoted, but they could never be feminine. The moment a Roman citizen appeared to blur the line between male and female, he ceased to be a proper Roman at all. This tension played out in countless ways throughout Roman society. Take the institution of marriage itself. While Roman law didn't recognize same-sex marriages in the way we might understand them today, there were certainly ceremonies, celebrations, and public acknowledgments of same-sex partnerships that looked remarkably like weddings. The Emperor Nero famously married 2 different men during his reign. The first, a freedman named Pythagoras, was given away at a ceremony where Nero himself played the role of bride complete with veil and dowry. The second, a young man named Sporus, who supposedly resembled Nero's dead wife Poppaea, was castrated and married to Nero in a ceremony where the emperor played the role of groom. These weren't secret affairs, they were public spectacles, attended by the great and good of Roman society. Gifts were given, toasts were made, jokes were told, and yet when Nero fell from power, these marriages were cited as evidence of his unfitness to rule, not because Romans disapproved of same-sex relationships, but because they disapproved of the confusion of gender roles these relationships seemed to represent. The contradiction was built into Roman DNA. They worshipped gods who changed gender at will. Jupiter had seduced Ganymede, the most beautiful of mortal boys, and carried him off to Olympus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. Apollo had loved Hyacinthus so deeply that when the boy died, the god transformed him into a flower, rather than let him fade from memory entirely. These stories were told and retold, painted on walls, carved into marble, woven into the very fabric of Roman religious life. Yet when mortals tried to live these divine freedoms, they ran headlong into human prejudices that were as rigid as they were arbitrary. Consider the curious case of Roman baths, those magnificent temples to cleanliness and social interaction that dotted the empire from Britain to Africa. These were spaces where nudity was not just accepted but required, where men of all social classes came together to bathe, exercise, gossip, and conduct business. They were also spaces of intense homoerotic possibility. Roman bath culture was designed around the display of the male body. Men oiled themselves, had slaves scrape the oil off with strigils, competed in athletic contests, and generally spent hours in various states of undress admiring each other's physiques. The homoerotic potential was so obvious that it became the subject of countless jokes, poems, and satirical observations. Yet the same Romans who spent their afternoons admiring naked men at the baths could turn vicious toward anyone suspected of actually acting on that admiration inappropriately. The key word here is inappropriately, because there were appropriate ways to express same-sex desire in Roman culture, and stepping outside those boundaries could be socially fatal. The appropriate way was through what we might call the mentor-protégé relationship. An older established Roman citizen could take a younger man under his wing, guide his education, advance his career, and yes, sometimes take him as a lover. This was seen as beneficial to both parties. The younger man gained protection, education, and social advancement. The older man gained companionship, sexual satisfaction, and the satisfaction of shaping a promising young life. But this relationship had to follow strict rules. The older man had to be genuinely older, not just richer or more powerful. The younger man had to be genuinely promising, not just beautiful. And most importantly, the relationship had to evolve over time. The sexual component was expected to fade as the younger man matured, replaced by lasting friendship and mutual respect. The Romans even had a word for men who violated these age-appropriate relationships. They called them pederasts, and they viewed them with suspicion and distaste. A Roman citizen who continued to pursue much younger men well into his own middle age was seen as undignified at best, predatory at worst. This brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of Roman same-sex relationships: their built-in temporality. Unlike heterosexual marriages, which were expected to last until death, same-sex relationships were understood to be phases, beautiful but temporary chapters in the larger story of a man's life. The Roman poet Horace captures this melancholy perfectly in his verses about aging and desire. He writes about the painful awareness that his youthful beauty is fading, that the young men who once competed for his attention are now looking elsewhere. There's no shame in this, just sadness, the universal human sadness of time passing and bodies changing. But there were exceptions to these rules, relationships that lasted decades and defied social expectations. The Emperor Trajan and his companion Lucius Quietus maintained what appeared to be a committed partnership for over 20 years. When Quietus died in battle, Trajan reportedly mourned him as deeply as any widower mourns a spouse. Similarly, the relationship between the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, seems to have been both political and deeply personal. When Verus died of plague during a military campaign, Marcus Aurelius wrote about him with a tenderness that goes far beyond political convenience or family obligation. These long-term relationships were possible, but they required careful navigation of social expectations. The partners had to maintain the fiction that their bond was primarily about friendship, mentorship, or political alliance. The emotional and sexual components had to remain largely private, expressed through letters, gifts, and private moments rather than public declarations. This privacy requirement created its own problems. Because same-sex relationships couldn't be openly acknowledged the way marriages could, they were vulnerable to gossip, manipulation, and political attack. A man's enemies could always whisper that his relationship with another man was somehow inappropriate, that he was too passive, too emotional, too feminine in his attachments. The Emperor Hadrian faced this problem constantly. Despite his obvious competence as a ruler and military commander, his grief for Antinous was used by his political opponents as evidence of weakness, of unmanly emotionality. The very depth of his love was turned into a weapon against him. This weaponization of same-sex desire was a constant feature of Roman political life. Men who were perfectly comfortable with their own same-sex relationships would attack their opponents for identical behavior. Cicero, who clearly had intense emotional relationships with younger men throughout his life, viciously attacked Mark Antony for supposedly being a passive partner in his youth. Caesar, who had his own well-documented affairs with men, was mocked by political opponents as every woman's husband and every man's wife. These attacks weren't really about sexual behavior. They were about power, about finding ways to diminish political opponents by questioning their masculinity. But they reveal something important about Roman attitudes. Same-sex desire was acceptable, even celebrated, but it had to be expressed within very specific parameters. Step outside those parameters, and you became vulnerable to social and political destruction. The parameters themselves were constantly shifting, influenced by politics, fashion, and the personal preferences of whoever happened to be in power at any given moment. What was acceptable under one emperor might be scandalous under the next. What was celebrated in one social circle might be condemned in another. This uncertainty created a climate of constant anxiety among Roman men who loved other men. They had to be perpetually alert to changing social winds, ready to adjust their behavior, their relationships, even their public personas, to match current expectations. They lived with the knowledge that their most intimate relationships could at any moment become sources of public shame or political vulnerability, and yet, they continued to love. They wrote poetry, exchanged gifts, formed partnerships that lasted decades. They found ways to express tenderness and devotion within a system that simultaneously celebrated and constrained them. They created a culture where same-sex love was both glorified and dangerous, both central to social life and perpetually marginal. Perhaps the most Roman thing of all was their ability to live with these contradictions without trying to resolve them. They didn't need their attitudes towards same-sex desire to be consistent or logical. They needed them to be useful, to serve the purposes of social order, political manipulation, and personal pleasure. This pragmatic approach to contradiction served them well in many areas of life. It allowed them to build an empire that lasted for centuries, incorporating wildly different cultures and belief systems without losing its essential Roman character. But it also meant that people who loved outside the prescribed boundaries lived in constant uncertainty, never quite sure whether their relationships would be celebrated or condemned. As we near the end of our journey through Roman attitudes towards same-sex love, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from their complex, contradictory approach. The Romans remind us that human sexuality has never been simple, that societies have always struggled to balance individual desire with social order, that love has always been both celebrated and constrained by the cultures that try to contain it. They also remind us that progress isn't linear. The Romans in many ways had more flexible attitudes towards same-sex desire than the Christian societies that followed them. They celebrated male beauty, honored same-sex relationships in their literature and art, and created social structures that allowed such relationships to flourish, albeit within strict boundaries. But they also show us the limitations of tolerance based on power, rather than equality. Roman acceptance of same-sex love was always conditional, always dependent on maintaining clear hierarchies of gender, age, and social status. It was a tolerance that could be withdrawn at any moment, that existed at the pleasure of those in power, rather than as a fundamental right. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 CE, it took with it this complex, contradictory attitude towards same-sex love. The Christian emperors, who had already begun to change Roman sexual culture, would be replaced by Germanic kings who had their own, very different ideas about appropriate male behavior. The Roman celebration of male beauty and same-sex desire would survive in art and literature, but the social structures that had supported it would disappear, and with that disappearance, something valuable was lost. Not the oppression, not the hypocrisy, not the cruelty that was also part of Roman sexual culture, but the recognition that love takes many forms, that human desire is complex and multifaceted, that societies are strongest when they find ways to honor the full range of human experience. The Romans, for all their faults, understood something that many later societies would forget, that same-sex love is not a deviation from human nature, but an expression of it. They may have hedged that understanding with restrictions and qualifications, but they never denied its fundamental truth. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of marble halls and olive groves, of poets writing passionate verses to beautiful young men, of emperors grieving their lost love so deeply that they remake the world in their honor. Perhaps you'll dream of a time when love, however complicated, however constrained, was still recognized as one of the great forces that shape human life. And perhaps you'll wake tomorrow with a deeper appreciation for the long, complex history of human desire, and the countless ways people have found to love each other across cultures, centuries, and the persistent human tendency to complicate the simple act of caring for another person. If you've stayed with me through our Roman journey, you've already proven yourself capable of holding contradictions in your mind without demanding neat resolutions. Good, you'll need that flexibility even more as we drift down the Nile into ancient Egypt, where love, like the river itself, followed patterns both predictable and mysterious. Egypt, land of pharaohs and pyramids, of gods with animal heads and humans with divine ambitions, a civilization that lasted over 3,000 years, longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Rome ever dreamed of enduring. And throughout those millennia, the Egyptians developed perhaps the most sophisticated and nuanced understanding of gender and sexuality the ancient world ever produced. But before we begin wandering through temple complexes and tomb paintings, let me dispel the first myth you're probably carrying about ancient Egypt, that it was obsessed with death. This is Victorian nonsense, the product of archaeologists who were so fascinated by mummies and burial goods that they forgot the Egyptians spent most of their time being gloriously, messily alive. The ancient Egyptians were in fact almost embarrassingly focused on life, pleasure, and the continuation of both into eternity. They invented eye makeup, not just for beauty, but to prevent eye infections. They created elaborate wigs, because they understood that looking good made you feel good. They threw parties that lasted for days, and left detailed records of their hangover cures. They were sensualists who happened to be very, very good at preserving things for posterity. And this sensual approach to life extended, naturally, to love and desire. But Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex relationships were both more accepting and more complex than even the Romans managed to achieve. Where Romans thought about sex in terms of power and dominance, Egyptians thought about it in terms of balance, harmony, and the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe from sliding into chaos. Picture, if you will, the court of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, around 1390 BCE. The New Kingdom is at its height. Egypt controls an empire stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates, and somewhere in the vast palace complex at Malkata, two young men are sharing wine and watching the sun set over the Nile. Their names are lost to us, but their story survives in fragments, painted on tomb walls and carved into private letters that somehow escaped the centuries. One is a scribe, educated and ambitious, his fingers permanently stained with ink from the reed pens he uses to record the business of empire. The other is a priest, shaven-headed and soft-spoken, dedicated to the service of Amun-Ra, but not so dedicated that he's forgotten the pleasures of human companionship. They are friends, lovers, and something more. They are what Egyptians called companions of the heart, a relationship category that had no direct equivalent in any other ancient culture. You see, the Egyptians believed that love was literally magical, not metaphorically magical, not poetically magical, but actually demonstrably magical. They thought that strong emotional bonds between people created invisible threads that connected their souls not just in life but in death and beyond. These threads were as real to them as the Nile itself, and just as necessary for the proper functioning of the universe. This belief had profound implications for how they understood same-sex relationships. Where other cultures might see such relationships as temporary, recreational, or at best complementary to real marriages, Egyptians could see them as cosmically significant, as essential to the maintenance of universal harmony as the annual flooding of the Nile. The evidence for this is everywhere, once you know how to look for it. Take the tomb of Khnumhotep and Ninkhnum, two men who served as royal manicurists to Pharaoh Nidserah around 2400 BCE. Their joint tomb at Saqqara contains some of the most intimate same-sex imagery ever discovered from the ancient world. They are shown embracing, nose to nose in the Egyptian gesture of lovers, their children playing at their feet, their wives standing respectfully to the side. Wait, did I mention their wives? Because here's where Egyptian attitudes become beautifully, bewilderingly complex. Khnumhotep and Ninkhnum were both married to women. They both had children. They both fulfilled their social obligations to produce heirs and maintain family lines. But their primary emotional and spiritual bond was clearly with each other, and everyone around them, including their wives, seems to have accepted this arrangement as perfectly normal. This wasn't unusual in ancient Egypt. Elite Egyptian men routinely maintained multiple types of relationships simultaneously: political marriages, romantic partnerships, spiritual bonds, and sexual liaisons that served different functions and carried different social meanings. The key was balance, the maintenance of harmony between competing needs and desires. Egyptian women, for their part, had far more freedom to form same-sex relationships than women in most ancient cultures. This was partly because Egyptian women enjoyed remarkable legal and economic independence. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and serve as priestesses in their own right. With this independence came the freedom to form emotional bonds that weren't entirely dependent on male approval or supervision. The tomb of Amenhotep Hears, two women who lived during the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, shows them in poses typically reserved for married couples. They are embracing, sharing food, and attending religious ceremonies together. Their tomb goods include jewelry, clearly meant to be worn as matching sets, cosmetic containers designed for two users, and furniture sized for intimate sharing. Were they lovers? Were they sisters? Were they wives of the same man who developed their own intimate bond? The Egyptians themselves seem to have been less interested in categorizing their relationship than in celebrating its depth and permanence. What mattered wasn't the exact nature of their bond but its strength, its contribution to the cosmic order, its role in maintaining the harmony that kept the universe functioning properly. This brings us to one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian attitudes towards sexuality: their understanding of gender as fluid rather than fixed. Egyptian mythology is full of gods who change gender, who combine male and female characteristics, who create new life without reference to biological sex. The sun god Ra could appear as male, female, or hermaphroditic depending on the needs of the moment. The goddess Mut was sometimes depicted with male genitalia. The god Atum created the first divine couple by masturbating them into existence, playing both male and female roles in the act of creation. This divine gender fluidity was reflected in human society in ways that would have horrified the Romans. Egyptian priests routinely performed rituals while cross-dressed, channeling the gender of whichever deity they were serving at the moment. Egyptian queens could adopt the regalia and prerogatives of kings when circumstances required it. Egyptian commoners seem to have had considerable freedom to express gender in ways that felt natural to them regardless of their biological sex. The most famous example of this gender fluidity is, of course, Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as a pharaoh for over 20 years, around 1479 to 1458 BCE. But Hatshepsut wasn't the only Egyptian ruler to blur gender boundaries. The mysterious pharaoh known as Neferukan, who may have been Queen Nefertiti ruling in her own right, adopted both male and female royal titles, and seems to have presented themselves as both king and queen simultaneously. These weren't isolated cases of political necessity or religious symbolism. They were expressions of a deep cultural understanding that gender, like everything else in Egyptian thought, was about balance and harmony rather than rigid categories. The universe needed both male and female energy to function properly, but that energy didn't have to be confined to biologically male or female bodies. This understanding extended to same-sex relationships in ways that were both more accepting and more spiritually significant than anything we see in other ancient cultures. Egyptian same-sex couples weren't just tolerated, they were understood to be performing a cosmic function, maintaining the balance between male and female energies that kept the world in order. The evidence for this is scattered throughout Egyptian religious texts, tomb decorations, and personal documents. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text from around 1600 BCE, matter-of-factly discusses treatments for anal injuries, without any moral judgment or social stigma. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus includes love spells designed to attract partners of the same sex. The Turin Erotic Papyrus depicts same-sex encounters, alongside heterosexual ones, as equally natural expressions of human desire. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from Egyptian concepts of the afterlife. Unlike other ancient cultures, which often depicted the afterlife as a place where earthly relationships were transcended or abandoned, Egyptians believed that love relationships continued and deepened after death. Married couples expected to be reunited in the afterlife, but so did same-sex partners, close friends, and anyone else whose souls had become intertwined during their earthly lives. The tomb inscriptions are remarkably explicit about this. Same-sex couples are described as being united in death as they were in life, as sharing eternity as they shared their earthly days, as joined in the afterlife by bonds that death cannot break. These aren't metaphorical descriptions, they are literal expectations, recorded with the same matter-of-fact detail as provisions for food, clothing, and furniture in the afterlife. This brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of Egyptian same-sex relationships, their integration into family life. Unlike Roman same-sex relationships, which existed parallel to but separate from family obligations, Egyptian same-sex partnerships seem to have been incorporated into extended family structures in ways that honored both individual desire and social responsibility. Take the case of Seneb, a court dwarf who lived during the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BCE. Seneb was married to a woman named Senetites and had several children, but his tomb also depicts him in intimate relationships with several men, apparently with his wife's knowledge and approval. The family tomb shows all of these relationships as equally important to Seneb's identity and equally deserving of commemoration in death. Or consider the household of Amenemheb, a new kingdom official, whose tomb depicts what appears to be a complex network of relationships involving multiple men and women in various combinations. The tomb art shows shared meals, religious ceremonies, and intimate moments that suggest a family structure based more on emotional bonds than on conventional marriage patterns. These complex family arrangements were possible because Egyptian society was remarkably flexible about kinship and household organization. Adoption was common and carried no stigma. Extended families often included multiple generations, distant relatives, close friends, and household servants in structures that prioritized emotional connection over biological relationship. Same-sex couples could adopt children, serve as foster parents to relatives' children, or simply maintain close relationships with the children of their friends and family members. The important thing wasn't who had given birth to whom, but who was committed to caring for whom throughout life and into the afterlife. This flexibility extended to economic arrangements as well. Egyptian same-sex couples could own property jointly, inherit from each other, and make legal arrangements for their mutual support that were recognized by courts and religious authorities. The legal papyri contain numerous examples of such arrangements, recorded with the same bureaucratic precision that Egyptians applied to all their legal documents. But Egyptian acceptance of same-sex relationships wasn't unlimited or unconditional. Like all aspects of Egyptian culture, it was governed by the principle of Ma'at, the cosmic order that required balance, harmony, and proper behavior from all members of society. Same-sex relationships were acceptable when they contributed to this cosmic order, problematic when they disrupted it. What constituted disruption? Primarily anything that interfered with the reproduction and continuation of family lines. Egypt was, despite its wealth and power, always conscious of its relatively small population and the need to maintain demographic stability. Same-sex relationships that prevented people from having children, or that caused social conflict within families or communities, could be seen as violations of Ma'at. This concern is reflected in some of the wisdom literature from the Middle Kingdom, which warns against exclusive same-sex relationships that might prevent men from marrying and producing heirs. The texts don't condemn same-sex desire itself, but they do counsel moderation and balance, suggesting that such relationships should complement rather than replace heterosexual marriages. There are also hints of class-based distinctions in Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex relationships. Elite Egyptians, who could afford multiple wives, concubines, and servants, had more freedom to explore diverse relationship patterns than common farmers or laborers, who needed to focus their limited resources on producing and raising children. But even these limitations were applied flexibly, with considerable attention to individual circumstances and social context. The key was not rigid rule-following, but the maintenance of harmony and balance in each specific situation. This flexible approach is beautifully illustrated by the story of Sisi and Khemwasit, two priests who served in the temple of Ptah, at Memphis during the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BCE. Their relationship was clearly romantic and probably sexual, but it was also deeply spiritual, involving shared religious duties, joint participation in temple rituals, and mutual commitment to serving their god. When Sisi died first, Kamwaset commissioned a tomb inscription that described their relationship in terms usually reserved for married couples. My beloved, my heart's companion, who brightened my days and sweetened my nights, who stood beside me in the temple and will stand beside me in eternity. But the inscription also emphasizes their religious devotion and their contribution to the temple community, making clear that their personal relationship strengthened rather than weakened their service to the gods. This integration of personal and spiritual life was characteristic of Egyptian same-sex relationships. Unlike Roman same-sex partnerships, which often had to be kept separate from public and religious life, Egyptian same-sex couples could serve together as priests, participate jointly in religious festivals, and receive official recognition for their contributions to temple communities. The Temple of Mut at Karnak contains several inscriptions honoring same-sex couples who served as priests, describing their relationships as blessed by the goddess and beneficial to the temple community. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera includes similar inscriptions, along with artistic depictions of same-sex couples participating in religious ceremonies alongside heterosexual married couples. This religious acceptance was possible because Egyptian theology understood love itself as a divine force, regardless of the gender of the people experiencing it. The goddess Hathor was said to bless all forms of love that brought joy and harmony to human life. The god bees protected households regardless of their composition, as long as they were characterized by mutual care and affection. But the most significant religious sanction for same-sex relationships came from the myth of Set and Horus, two male gods, whose complex relationship combined elements of rivalry, romance and spiritual transformation. In some versions of the myth, Set and Horus are lovers whose sexual relationship helps to maintain the cosmic balance between order and chaos. In others, they are rivals whose conflict eventually resolves into mutual respect and cooperation. The myth was interpreted differently in different periods and regions, but it consistently provided a divine model for intense same-sex relationships that combined physical desire, emotional intimacy, and spiritual significance. Egyptian same-sex couples could see their own relationships reflected in this divine partnership, validated by the gods themselves. This divine validation extended to the afterlife in ways that were unique among ancient cultures. Egyptian funerary texts include numerous references to same-sex couples being reunited in death, sharing eternal life in the field of reeds, the Egyptian equivalent of paradise. These reunions are described with the same joyful anticipation as heterosexual marriages, complete with detailed descriptions of the pleasures the couples would enjoy together in eternity. The Book of Coming Forth by Day, better known as the Book of the Dead, includes spells specifically designed to ensure that same-sex lovers would recognize and find each other in the afterlife. These spells were buried with individuals who wanted to guarantee their reunion with beloved partners of the same sex, treated with the same reverence as spells for more conventional family reunions. But perhaps the most moving evidence of Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex love comes from their personal correspondence, letters that have survived in the dry climate to give us intimate glimpses of how people actually felt about their relationships. A letter from the New Kingdom, written by a man named Hori to his male partner Amenemheb, captures the tenderness and longing that characterized many Egyptian same-sex relationships. My heart aches with missing you. The days pass like years when you are away. I count the hours until your return like a priest counting offerings. Come back to me soon, my beloved, for I am incomplete without you. Another letter, from a woman named Isis to her female companion Tara, expresses similar devotion. You are the light of my days and the peace of my nights. When I wake in the morning, my first thought is of you. When I sleep in the evening, your face is the last thing I see. Distance cannot diminish what we share, for our souls are joined beyond the reach of miles or years. These letters reveal relationships of remarkable depth and commitment, partnerships that provided emotional sustenance, intellectual companionship, and spiritual connection in ways that transcended the gender of the participants. They show us people who understood their same-sex relationships, not as alternatives to real love, but as expressions of love in its most essential form. The consistency of these expressions across centuries and social classes suggests that Egyptian acceptance of same-sex love was not merely tolerant, but genuinely celebratory. These relationships weren't just permitted, they were honored, blessed, and expected to continue into eternity. This positive attitude persisted even as Egypt came under foreign influence during the later periods of its history. When the Greeks conquered Egypt under Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, they encountered Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex relationships that were in many ways more sophisticated than their own. Greek writers like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus commented with surprise on Egyptian sexual customs, noting the integration of same-sex couples into family and religious life. The Romans, when they conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, were similarly impressed by Egyptian sexual flexibility. Roman writers describe Egyptian same-sex couples with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, unable to understand how such relationships could be so thoroughly integrated into social and religious life. But foreign conquest eventually took its toll on Egyptian sexual culture, as it did on all aspects of Egyptian civilization. The introduction of Christianity in the early centuries CE brought with it attitudes towards sexuality that were far more restrictive than traditional Egyptian beliefs. Same-sex relationships, which had been celebrated for millennia, gradually became controversial and eventually forbidden. The process was slow and uneven. Egyptian Christianity retained some of the flexibility of traditional Egyptian religion, and same-sex relationships continued in private long after they had disappeared from public life. But the divine validation, the religious celebration, the social integration that had characterized Egyptian same-sex love for thousands of years, gradually eroded under the pressure of new religious and cultural influences. By the time of the Arab conquest in 641 CE, traditional Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex relationships had largely disappeared from official culture, though they persisted in folk beliefs and private practices for centuries afterward. The elaborate tomb decorations, the joint burial practices, the religious celebrations of same-sex love became things of the past, remembered only in archaeological remains and ancient texts. What was lost with this transformation? Not just tolerance or acceptance, but a sophisticated understanding of love as a cosmic force that transcended gender, a vision of the afterlife as a place where all forms of love were celebrated and continued, a social structure that could honor both individual desire and collective responsibility. The Egyptians had created something remarkable, a culture where same-sex love was not just permitted but sanctified, where same-sex couples could expect their relationships to be blessed by the gods and continued in eternity, where gender itself was understood as fluid and changeable, rather than fixed and limiting. They had done this not by rejecting family values or social responsibility, but by expanding their definitions of both to include the full range of human emotional and spiritual experience. They had shown that it was possible to honor same-sex love without abandoning heterosexual marriage, to celebrate gender fluidity without losing social stability, to integrate diverse forms of relationships into coherent family and community structures. As we reach the end of our journey down the Nile, it's worth reflecting on what Egyptian attitudes towards same-sex love can teach us about the possibilities and limitations of sexual tolerance in human societies. The Egyptians remind us that acceptance of sexual diversity is not a modern invention, but an ancient human capacity, one that has been expressed in different ways across cultures and centuries. They also remind us that such acceptance is fragile, dependent on broader cultural and religious contexts that can change with conquest, conversion, or social transformation. The Egyptian celebration of same-sex love lasted for 3 millennia, longer than most civilizations have existed, but it still eventually succumbed to forces that valued conformity over diversity, restriction over celebration. But perhaps most importantly, the Egyptians show us that it is possible to create cultures where love is understood as a universal human capacity that transcends the accidents of gender, where relationships are valued for their emotional and spiritual content, rather than their biological configuration, where the diversity of human desire is seen as a reflection of divine creativity, rather than a threat to social order. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of temple courtyards, where same-sex couples served the gods together, of tomb chambers decorated with images of eternal love in all its forms, of a civilization that understood love as the force that kept the universe in harmony. Perhaps you'll dream of the Nile flowing endlessly toward the sea, carrying with it the stories of countless couples whose love was strong enough to last not just a lifetime but an eternity. And perhaps you'll wake tomorrow, with a deeper appreciation for the long history of human love in all its forms, and the persistent human capacity to create cultures that honor rather than constrain the full range of human emotional experience. Sleep well, dear listeners. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still stand, and somewhere in the desert sands lie the tombs of lovers whose devotion was so strong that they expected it to last forever. In a world that often seems to have forgotten such possibilities, their faith in eternal love offers both comfort and inspiration. The ancient world, for all its limitations and cruelties, knew something we sometimes forget, that love in all its forms is the force that makes life worth living and death worth transcending. May your dreams be filled with such love, and may you wake with the knowledge that you are part of this ancient continuing story of human hearts seeking connection across all the barriers that time and culture can create.